Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me along to your forum today. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting. For me, that's the Yagara and Turrbal people, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So before I start, thank you. Yes, I am a rare disease parent, and I guess I've come to the role at Rare Voices through quite a bit of experience with the PBAC and other government pathways for reimbursement of treatments. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but Rare Voices Australia is the peak body for Australians living with a rare disease. It has been in existence for 10 years this year, and the focus is very much on policy and systems rather than the individual rare diseases, because obviously there's fantastic organisations like CTF who can work with the individual patient groups. So a lot of the work we do is about changing the policy settings and systematic settings that create problems for rare disease or challenges for rare disease patients in Australia. And as part of that, we led the collaborative development of the National Strategic Action Plan for Rare Diseases, and that's the government's policy response to the common challenges experienced by rare disease families. And that's important because part of that is addressing some of the inequities that rare disease patients have experienced in accessing treatments. It's relevant today as we talk there, because often the treatments are for very small patient groups or subsets of already small patient groups. They can experience a number of challenges in making their way through Australia's regulatory frameworks, both in getting approval, but probably more difficult is to get the reimbursement, which is when those drugs are available through the PBS at a cost that's acceptable and manageable for patients. So the action plan, I think it's just to say a little bit about that. It was developed through extensive consultation with the community, including rare disease patients, rare disease organisations, rare disease clinicians and researchers, industry and government. And I think it is important and possibly useful when you're thinking about your submission to really raise awareness with the PBAC that this is for a fairly rare condition with a fairly small patient group. The work that RVA has done has made the PBAC much more aware, I think, of some of the specific challenges of rare diseases, some of the general challenges of rare diseases, and I guess then it's your role to help them be more aware of the specific challenges of yours. So what is the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, or PBAC as we all call it, because it's too hard to keep on saying it all the time? But what's important to understand, it's an independent expert body. It's been appointed by the Australian government, and members there are doctors, health professionals, health economists and consumer representatives. What it does is recommend new medicines for listing on the PBS. So the medicine is recommended to the government, and then the government can choose to accept or not accept a recommendation, but no medicine can be put on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme without having a recommendation from the PBAC. And the PBAC meets 3 times a year. And at the November meeting, as has already been stated, I won't be able to say the name, now I can't say it, but selumetinib will be considered for paediatric patients with inoperable plexiform neurofibromatosis. So I think that's the group that it is being considered for. So it's important to know that when you're making your comment. And I guess to understand what are they looking at, what does the PBAC look at, it takes into account the medical conditions and whether or not the medicine is registered for use in Australia, and that's when it goes through the Therapeutic Goods Administration. And then it considers clinical effectiveness, safety and cost effectiveness, or value for money compared with other treatments. So some things to know about this is that cost effectiveness is always assessed, and it is a legal requirement that that be done, and that it is a comparator system. So the PBAC is always looking at what's the comparator, and I think that Jim really highlighted very clearly the comparator at this stage is surgery, because there have been no other treatments available. And again, that's probably something to keep in mind as I talk you through how to make a comment. So PBAC has a way to engage with consumers, and that this has really grown quite a lot over the last 10 or 15 years that I've been involved, and become quite an important part of what it does. So consumers can make a comment via the Office of Health Technology Assessments consultation hub, and I'm going to show you that in a moment so you can see what it looks like and what you'll be looking for when you go in, and then I can provide the links later. So a consumer could include anyone. It can be people diagnosed with the condition, their family and friends, clinicians, researchers, members of the public. There's no limitation in consumer comment, in that consumer comment section of who can put a comment in. When you go in to make the comment, it'll ask you what your relationship is with the condition and how you heard about the treatment and that sort of thing. So they do, I guess, have a look at who is making the comment. What they're very interested in now is a survey, which I think is really useful because it really sets out the things that they are interested in consumers talking about and gives quite a lot of guidance about what you can include. So what it does is a survey, and it asks questions about what it is like to live with the condition and what advantages or disadvantages a consumer might perceive to be associated with a particular treatment. So knowing that I'll talk a little bit about what the questions are. So just before I get to the questions, the key dates that you just need to keep in mind, particularly for this one, is that the consumer comment is currently open and it will close on the 21st of September. So you've got a bit of time to put a comment in, and it can take as little or as long as you like. And there's also potential for you to go in, look at the questions, start something, and go back out if you want to think about it more or discuss it more with families or friends. So once the comments are closed, the PBAC Consumer Committee then reviews all of the comments, and they prepare a report about the input of consumers, and that will go to the whole committee, and the whole committee will consider that as part of their consideration of the treatment. And that consideration happens on the 2nd to the 4th of November, and then the outcome will be published on the 16th of December. So it's quite a process, and I think as Jim highlighted, it's a long process even to get a treatment to the PBAC. So there's some good research, I suppose, that shows that often rare disease therapies are taking 2 to 5 years longer to get to Australian patients than comparable jurisdictions, and there's a range of reasons for that. Obviously, one of them is the population size here compared to maybe some of the other areas, but others is about sometimes the challenges of getting a rare disease therapy through the reimbursement pathway, and it's not uncommon to see resubmissions for rare disease therapies. So when that outcome is published, there are 3 possible outcomes. The first outcome is that it will be recommended. Now, that means that the PBAC has decided that it meets clinical and cost effectiveness criteria and is considered value for money, and it is recommending to the government that they then add it to the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, meaning it would be accessible to patients at a subsidised rate. Now then, once that happens, if it's a positive recommendation, there's still quite a few processes to go through. And so from the point of a positive recommendation, the government still has to accept the recommendation. And then there's a fair few administrative processes to complete before a treatment would come. So even if it was a positive recommendation on the 16th of December, that doesn't actually mean that patients would have access immediately. It can take between 6 and 12 months to complete all of those additional processes and have it accessible on a PBS. The second possible outcome is a deferral, and a deferral means that there are some key uncertainties in the application or the submission that's come from the sponsor that the PBAC would like more information, and in which case then the sponsor, who is the company involved, will go back and get that additional information and provide it back to the PBAC to be considered at a later date. And then the final final possible outcome is that it is not recommended. But I guess I just want to say to you that not recommended doesn't mean it's the end of the road, and it's not uncommon for rare disease therapies to need a resubmission. And the reason usually for resubmission is the level of uncertainty or things that are uncertain is too high, and there might be more evidence required to address those uncertainties. So why is it so important for you as a consumer, particularly in the rare disease space, to make a consumer comment? I think the most important thing is that as rare disease consumers, we have a lived experience that provides evidence about things like burden of care, the current treatment options, which again, as Jim really highlighted, the only other current treatment option is surgery. So I think, when you're thinking about your comment highlighting the benefits of this possible treatment over surgery or any concerns that you might have about the treatment over surgery, it allows us to describe the impact of living with a particular condition. And this is so important in rare conditions because often the impact and lived experience is not well understood. And it really is the patients who are living it and their families day to day who can say so clearly, this is actually what it's like to live with this condition day in, day out. This is the burden it puts on. This is how it affects my daily life or my family members' daily life. And that's the kind of information that the PBAC is looking for. So the other thing it does is addresses any gaps and uncertainties, or can address some of the gaps and uncertainties in the data. So sometimes looking at clinical data doesn't actually give you a real picture of what that means in a patient's life. So what your job, I guess, is to explain what it means to those people who live with it, and whether that's you as a carer, a family member, a friend, or a person who has actually been diagnosed. You really have that capacity to help the PBAC understand what it's like day in, day out, and what it's like to go through the surgeries or have the side effects from those surgeries. You can talk to any kinds of things because, as Jim said, quality of life is quite important, and talking to things about quality of life, about feeling included in my particular patient group, kids being bullied, the mental health impacts, the incredible burden of care that goes with the treatment that's involved in those set of disorders. These are the kinds of things that people talk about in their submissions. So this is what it looks like where you go to make a comment. It's at the OHTA consultations.health.gov.au website. And you can see there, that's where you make your submission. What you do is, I hope you can see, you click on the link, that link to the PBAC. And when you go into the link, then you actually select the medication that you're commenting on. That medication will not be under its commercial name. It will be alphabetically under its generic name, which I'm going to have another attempt at saying and see if I can do it. Selumetinib, that's what you're looking for. And then next to it will be the commercial name, which you may know it by. So you go in there, and once you're in and have selected that, what happens is that it will take you through a series of questions. First, you'll just provide some contact details and a bit of generic information, but the 5 main questions that you will be asked when you go into comment are: the first one, please outline your experience with the medical or health condition. And so that's really an opportunity, I think, for you to give the committee, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, an understanding of what it's like to live with the condition, explaining what it's like, giving a picture of the day-to-day living. So, for example, I just worked with a patient group recently, and what they were talking about is the incredible fatigue that they experienced day to day, how that impacted on their life, their work, their engagement with social activities, their engagement with employment activities, their engagement with physical activities. Some people, particularly at the moment, many rare disease patients are immunocompromised, and so living in an age of COVID has added anxiety and stress and a higher degree of isolation to a population who already often feel quite isolated. The second thing that you'll be asked about is how is the condition currently treated? And again, this is where you can talk about how you feel about the current treatment options, any positives or negatives that you have, what your experience of those treatments are. The third question is what you see as the advantages of the proposed medicine. And this can be if you've had access to it through a clinical trial, one of the clinical trials that has been described here, or if you haven't had access but you've heard about it, what you would think would be the benefits or what you perceive to be the benefits of it. And again, what I'd encourage you to do, I'll get into some tips in a moment, but to be quite specific about what you see the benefits are, and in all of these things be specific rather than general. So a temptation can think for patients is to think it's obvious what the benefits would be, or it's obvious what the impacts would be. But because this is actually an exercise in collecting evidence, it's important that you don't stay too general or think that it is obvious to people and you get into describing it. So as an example, one of the patient groups that I worked with, the comparator was an infusion that was given in an outpatient setting at the hospital, and the current treatment was every 2 weeks, and the treatment that the PBA was considering was every 8 weeks. Now, I think that it would be easy to think, oh, it's obvious what the benefits of an 8-week versus a 2-weekly infusion is. But when we talked with the patient group, it was really about highlighting some of the really important things. So people talked about, so example, one of the patients talked about on a 2-weekly infusion, they had to make their employer aware that they had this condition. It limited their capacity to travel in their role, even though it was a role that generally would have to travel. So it always had to be planned around their infusion. And what they felt about an 8-weekly infusion that they were able to speak to was the possibility that they would never have to tell their employer even that they had a rare condition, much less that they had to have treatment, because at 8-weekly infusions they could manage to do that on time off or time in lieu, and then their capacity to develop their career further because they could travel more and be freer to travel because of the limitations of the 2 weeks being lifted. So they're the kinds of practical lived things that we as patients really know, and we experience it every day, and they're often not captured in clinical data. Even a quality of life measure in a clinical trial does not capture that impact of quality of life. So they're the types of things that I would encourage you to talk about if you see there are advantages, and then what are the disadvantages of the proposed medicine. And again, Jim gave some really good examples of some of the potential side effects and how they might impact on patients, and you may wish to comment on that and also comment on how well they're managed. And then finally, if you have any additional comments, you can add those at that time. So when you go in to the site that I indicated, this site here, and excuse me, click through, these are actually laid out for you to go through. And when you go to the actual question, the PBAC has also provided some helpful tips about the kinds of things that you might want to talk about and include. So it's really, I think it's quite user-friendly for most people. It gives you lots of information about the types of things to talk through, and it does make it fairly straightforward to give a useful and quality consumer comment to the PBAC. And you're also able to upload documents if that's what you want to do. So if you wanted to just write this as a Word file, if you wanted to record it on a video, you can do all of those things. So any format that works for you. But I would really encourage you to be guided to make sure you have responded to those questions, because they are the questions that PBAC has deemed to be important. So these are just some tips, and these tips have come from the Patient Voice Initiative, and you can see their website down the bottom there, and I'm going to direct you there because they have lots of excellent resources, including some do's and don'ts and some guides of making a PBAC comment. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. I think I've spoken about a few of them already, but I'll go into them a bit more. The first one is don't give general information, do be specific. So don't say, this would improve my quality of life. Explain how it would improve your quality of life. So if it's, that it's less surgeries and going through the trauma of surgery, then talk about that. If it's that the smiling face that we saw with that really significant tumour reduction, reduction in pain, reduction in daily living challenges, they are the types of things, but in a specific way, not a general way. So the next thing is don't cut and paste. And I'm sure that in my community, many family and friends have wanted to comment and support efforts to access treatments. And it's tempting to think it's just fine for them to just put in the same comment or exactly a similar comment to you. I really would encourage you not to do cut and paste and no template responses. So the PBAC aren't looking for numbers, they're looking for evidence. So 10 of the same comment is not as good as one really good comment that really highlights the issues. So share what you know, share your experience. Lived experience is expertise, and as patients or carers of patients, we're the only people who have often that experience and know what it's like day to day. So that's what you're trying to share. Next thing is don't explain the condition. So the PBAC will have a massive dossier from the sponsor, which is the company, explaining the condition, explaining the science, explaining the pathways, explaining the way that the treatment works. And as patients, we don't need to do that. And it's really more explaining the reality of living with the condition that you're trying to do. So don't feel you need to be scientific or technical. In your own words, explaining the reality of what it's like for you will be the strongest comment that you can make. Don't worry about submitting published literature and stats. Again, the company will have collected a number of those already and be pointing to those. Do submit the numbers that matter to you. It's this many surgeries, it's this many days off work or school, it's this much pain medication, or this level of pain that I experience. So rather than trying to be scientific, again, that what you're bringing is the personal voice, the lived experience. And, I've spent a lot of time talking to the members of the PBAC and trying to understand the best way to make a comment. And I was at a session and one of the members of the committee said one of the most effective submissions that they'd ever seen is when somebody actually described their whole day to that person, what their day was like. And that might have been getting up and taking a medication. That might have been stopping in the middle of a class or something because the pain was too difficult. It might have been not wanting to go to a social function because of fatigue. It might have been not wanting to go to social function because of feelings of exclusion or not wanting to participate in the sport. So if you can explain the numbers that are meaningful to you in a personal way, that's a really useful thing to do. Again, don't explain the treatment. The PBAC will have loads and loads and loads and loads of data about the treatment. What you're going to explain is the reality of having or not having the treatment. So if you've been on a clinical trial or you've had access through a scheme, you are able to describe that in detail, what difference it made in your life and in your quality of life and your experience of life. When I say quality of life, it doesn't mean that you don't have to talk about clinical outputs. In our community, there are a number of comorbidities associated with the condition that are quite high. One of the things I noticed Jim talking about was that cognitive and neurological functioning, and it is similar in our patient group. And so many people talked about reductions or improvements in cognitive functioning or improvements in mental well-being or mood stabilisation. And that can be the sorts of things that you could talk about. And if you don't have access to the treatment, what's the reality of living with the current treatment option of surgery? What does that look like for you? What impact does it have on your life and on your family life? So I guess in summary, the first thing to say is that your experience and your input is really important. And it's important to help the PBAC really understand these conditions, and especially when it's the first treatment that's coming for a particular condition and the PBAC may not be overly familiar with the condition, that information that you provide is valuable, and it really helps them to understand as they deliberate on the medicine or the treatment what the potential benefits are and therefore how to assess the value of that medicine. Speak in your own words and be specific. So, and I always say in my own patient group, if you only have 10 minutes to do it, do what you can in 10 minutes. If you've got half an hour, do it. If it's easier to come in and out, do it that way as well. But really speak in your own voice, and if other members of your family or your network want to comment, the kinds of things they can comment on is their perception. So I think, you know, in some of the submissions that when our patient group has gone, my family have commented on the burden of care that goes with the particular condition that my daughter has that requires several hours every day to manage the condition. And it's quite expensive to manage, just the nature of the condition. So they're the kinds of things that they commented on. So they commented from their own perspective, not trying to comment from my perspective. When you go into the consultation survey, it really does give you some very helpful advice about what you can include in your answers. You can also reach out to, and this email address is on that website that I sent you to, but the HTA Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit are also there to help anyone who's confused or unclear or wants some clarification. And the Patient Voice Initiative, which is where I got those hints and tips, is an excellent resource. It's got some do's and don'ts tips, and it's got a guide to responding that can be really, really helpful. So there's a lot of support in doing this, and it's also a really important and a useful thing to do because it will help the PBAC in their deliberations. So now if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Louise. That was really informative. Is there any questions to start off in the room at all around submissions and what might need to happen? I do have one online around, is there any scenario where the PBAC would actually meet directly with patient groups, a forum or something where they could talk directly in that space to kind of get their views put across?
So at the discretion of the PBAC for a complex submission, they may reach out to the patient group and request a meeting to do that. So there are some circumstances in which that's happened, but really is that not at the discretion of the patient group or an individual patient, but at the discretion of the PBAC.
Would that normally, just out of curiosity, would that normally improve the chances of that particular drug going through in the first submission, or?
It's really impossible to say. I mean, what I would really say is that it's a really complex process, and I think it's important for patient groups to understand we're only part of the picture, so we can address some uncertainties, but if there are uncertainties, for example, in the economic model or in the clinical data or in the cost effectiveness ratios proposed by the company, there's nothing that generally that the patient group can do to address those. So it's important to understand the reason it takes so long is before it gets to the committee, it's been through two other subcommittees, drug utilisation subcommittee and an economics utilisation subcommittee. So the process of evaluating a treatment is incredibly complex. So I wouldn't say it's the tipping point one way or another for a patient group to meet. It can be useful and helpful. I think the real use is if you think other treatments are coming, that ability to start really explaining to the PBAC what the experience of your patient group is can be useful.
Amazing, thank you. Were there any other questions in the room? Nope. Thank you so much, Louise, and we'll move on to our next speaker.